You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 210. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me here this week. I am thrilled to have you here and very excited to introduce you to our incredible guest, Stephanie Mitchell. Stephanie, if she is new to you, is a professional speaker and coach who specializes in clear communication in writing and presenting. Stephanie speaks regularly at law firms and other professional organizations across North America, and she often visits Vancouver, where I have the distinct pleasure of meeting her in person for lunch. So she and I have had lots of really excellent conversations over the years about lawyers in particular, professional development, speaking, communication, all of the things. And I'm thrilled to have her here to share about presenting today. Now, Stephanie has a unique background. She has degrees in both journalism and in law. And she is a return guest to the podcast. She was here way back in November 2022. We spoke about building connection in virtual times. And at the time, we were still coming off the pandemic. It wasn't the way it is now with a lot more, well, really a return to normal. And what we talked about remains relevant because we continue to have that virtual connection in addition to the in-person connection. So that's a great episode. You're welcome to go back to that, episode 77, to learn more and hear more from the incredible Stephanie Mitchell. So with that, Stephanie, I would love to welcome you and thank you for joining us on this week's podcast episode.
Thank you so much, Paula. I'm really glad to be here. And that's such a generous introduction. I feel like, I must have so much to share. This is great.
Well, you absolutely do. I mean, since we met, which now goes back several years, I think it was actually pre-pandemic, so maybe 5+ years, you were already presenting regularly at firms. And I remember picking your brain at the very beginning. Oh, so how do you do this? How do you structure your presentations? And so now I have a chance to have that conversation with you with the benefit of our guests who are here today. And also, in the meantime, I've also been presenting. So I'm excited to trade notes and learn from you and to share with those who have joined us today some tips, some strategies about public speaking, because it's something that unless you do it often, it can feel really intimidating. And to learn from an expert like you really is a blessing. So I'm excited to dive in. And I think for that first question, to orient our listeners, I would love to ask you how you would define public speaking.
That's a great question because so many people, I think when they picture public speaking, might picture someone standing up in front of an audience of thousands with the bright lights and the big microphone and you're alone on the stage, like maybe a TED Talk or a big conference. That's one end of public speaking. Definitely. I think public speaking, though, goes all the way back to the much smaller interactions that are just as important, if not more important sometimes, that we all have in our professional lives. Could also have them in our lives volunteering as well with the personal projects we're involved in. But, thinking about speaking up at maybe a client meeting or at a work event that's much smaller, it might be more informal, but you're making an impression on the people you're talking to, wherever you are, however many other people are in the room with you.
Amazing. I completely agree. I think there's the notion of public speaking in that first sense that you described it, where you've got an audience and you're taking the stage and it's very much set up as a presentation, basically. And at the same time, there are those inter-office interactions where you're a junior lawyer speaking to a partner about a file, or you have a meeting with your client and you're delivering some difficult news. And so I'm thrilled to have you here so that we can talk about presenting, speaking in a way that you can do that effectively, whether you are delivering a formal presentation or if it's one of those more informal interactions. Now, for lawyers. And I'm thinking of the range that you have within your practice. If you're a litigator, you're in court, you're in front of a judge, you're doing quite a bit of the more formal public speaking as we traditionally think about it. And as a solicitor, maybe you're not doing that, but you are still speaking, right? You're having discussions with your clients, with other lawyers. So if we think about public speaking, why does it matter for lawyers?
Why does it matter? It gets back to why many people are afraid of it as well. It matters because it's part of how you build your professional reputation, the way you're speaking to someone. Every interaction you have helps that other person build a picture of who you are as a professional, as a lawyer. Are you someone they can trust? Someone who can think on their feet, someone who can help them solve a problem, someone who's very persuasive at getting that argument across with well-researched argument that's coming out? Are you someone who believes in what you're saying, who sounds confident, someone other people would trust and want to listen to?
100%. I think you've hit the nail on the head with the confidence and the trust. And those are both critical for the relationships that you have with other lawyers, with your clients. And you're absolutely right that speaking is how people experience you, right? They form their impression based on how you communicate with them. And at the same time, public speaking is one of those things that so many people are afraid of. And so when it comes to lawyers, what do you find holds them back from public speaking?
This is really interesting. I think it's the same thing that holds lawyers back from many areas of possible growth, which is wanting to be perfect. And this comes out of a great place of wanting to do an excellent job. Comes through in so many different parts of a lawyer's career, wanting to be excellent. And this is partly why lawyers have such high standards, and this is a really good thing. But when it comes to public speaking, we are exposed to other, maybe more senior lawyers, people who've had more practice at it, who are already very good at it, who are excellent, who seem like they can do it without even thinking about it. Oh, that's easy. And then it can be quite nerve-wracking for especially a younger lawyer who hasn't had as much experience with it, especially in the last few years as we've done more things virtually as well, not been in person. They haven't also been around the older lawyers to see it modeled, how it's done. So that can just make you feel more nervous about it because you're afraid you won't do as good a job as you want to. To which I would say, you have to start somewhere. And we'll talk more about preparing how to do a great job public speaking. But the fact that you're thinking about it and that you're trying and that you want to do an excellent job means you're on the right track and means you're heading in the right direction.
Absolutely. And Stephanie, I love how you've illustrated that gap, that desire for it to be perfect, that we are surrounded by others who are doing brilliant speaking. And so there's this feeling of, well, how do I get from where I am to where I want to be? And thrilled to have our listeners here today who are going to learn some strategies, some ideas, some tips to help bridge that gap, some of the steps they can take between where they are, where they want to be to get to that point. I have noticed in the work that I do with lawyers, particularly when it comes to perfectionism, possibly procrastination, that what is underlying that is that fear or anxiety of it not being perfect. Sometimes it's writing a brief. You don't even want to pick up the pen because the thing that you want to deliver, that you want to submit to the court, you have this expectation in mind that it's going to be this way, and you might feel anxious about even getting started. So with public speaking, in particular, where not only are you, I guess if you're writing a brief, you're in the privacy of your office, nobody's really watching you. But when you step out onto the stage, the eyes are on you. So it can induce worry, anxiety among many people. So what tips do you have to manage or reduce anxiety about speaking in public?
First, I want to say that everyone gets anxious about speaking in public because we know that we'll be, making this impression on other people, and that matters. So it's perfectly normal to have a bit of anxiety around it. So thinking about managing your anxiety, which is so normal, first thing I would recommend is preparing, being as prepared as you can be without staying up all night. But taking time to think about, so what is your key message? What do you really want to get across here? And as you think about preparing, this is where you always really think about, who are you going to be talking to? Who is your audience? It's not about you and your performance. It's about connecting with your audience, the people you're talking to, and having something of value to share with them. So that's one really important part. And if you're prepared, you know what you want to say. Even if you stumble or you get thrown off when you're speaking, you can kind of come back to your key message. You can get back on track with what you know is important. So being prepared is really helpful. Also, before you start speaking, suddenly you might feel very stressed and like your body is almost betraying you. So you're like, I can't even do this. Your heart is racing. Maybe you're sweating more. You feel really hot. Your stomach is hurting. Maybe you're clenching your fists. Your jaw is tight. And that's your stress response. And a good thing to know is that it's actually not a bad thing to feel a bit of that stress response, because what it means is that your brain is firing on all cylinders, and that makes things happen in your body. But it means that your brain is alert, it's ready to go, and your body is ready to support you in this somewhat high stress situation. So it's really natural to feel a little bit of stress, a little bit of fear before you start speaking. And when that happens, a good thing to do is to take a deep breath, to remind yourself this is normal. This is a good thing. Your body is ready to support your brain. And then, think about, what's your key message? What do you want to share here? And then trust yourself, get out there and do it. The important thing to know too is, the more you expose yourself to this thing that feels uncomfortable, to putting yourself out there and presenting, the more you learn, this is okay. This will work. And your brain stops coding it as a threat. So you get to feel more and more comfortable the more that you do it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm going to circle back and just kind of recap a little bit and add a couple things. I love what you said about being prepared. And that applies to the conversation you're having with the partner about the file or the client. The more prepared you are, the more comfortable you're going to feel. That's just a given. And I completely agree. What are the key messages that you want to communicate, and who are you communicating to? Your audience obviously informs the way that you're going to communicate. If it's a judge, or if it's a client, or if it's another lawyer, that matters. And I love what you said there too about thinking about the other person. It puts you in that place of service. If you're thinking about delivering value to somebody else, it takes the focus off of you. So I completely agree. And I think that's such helpful advice for everybody who's listening.
What you're saying, I love that, being of service is a great way to think about it. And I know sometimes if I have a presentation that doesn't go perfectly, I think to myself, well, did I offer anything of value? Did I share valuable information? Yes, I did. Lots of valuable information. Even if I know it wasn't absolutely perfect, although I'm aiming for that too. Even if I know it's really comforting to know that, because that is what it's about. It's not about whether I did it perfectly. It's really about sharing that value with the other person or people.
100%. And that self-reflection after, and we'll speak more about this, assuming we have time to get through the questions. Stephanie,
So
I have
many
some questions. That post-speaking review, right? What worked, what didn't work? What did you deliver that was of value? I think that's a really important part of the exercise, because as we've talked about, it takes quite a bit out of you depending on what it is that you're doing. And so you want to be able to evaluate what worked here. What did I provide of value? What would I do differently next time? And so giving yourself that space and compassion, and maybe it landed really well with some people and others not so much. And that too is part of the experience and the unpredictable nature that sometimes comes along with public speaking. So I loved that you focused on service, right? What's the message? Who are you speaking to? You talked about that stress response, and that's something that I speak with clients about as well, right? And the way that you characterize that feeling in your body, right? You talked about, the stress response, your heart beats faster, maybe you're breathing faster. You might feel that nervous sense of whatever that feels like for you. And there's some really interesting research, and I've talked about it on the podcast before. Kelly McGonigal, she's an American psychologist who's done some really great work around stress, including writing a book called The Upside of Stress. And there's a companion TED Talk. It's, I think, 10 minutes. And it talks about how the way that we perceive stress will have a direct impact on how our body physiologically experiences stress. And a shorthand, much like you've suggested, the way that you talk to yourself matters. So a shorthand of, I'm terrified of doing this, telling yourself I'm excited to do this is a shift, right? It can help you shift from that feeling of anxious into more of an excited state. Now, granted, we'll probably still feel nervous, especially if it's a big talk or there's a lot at stake, but you're onto yourself. And so I'm so glad that you highlighted that. And then finally, yes, repetition. The more you do it, the more you speak in public, the more conversations you have that are uncomfortable, you're just going to start feeling better and more at ease. And I would agree that you never really stop. I worked with a very senior lawyer who at one point told me, he was a litigator, still is, and said, I still get nervous before court appearances. And that's a good thing. If I stop being nervous, then to me, that's a problem. So, I think that is comforting for anybody who's maybe at the more junior level thinking, is there something wrong because I'm nervous? And the answer is no, like it's absolutely part of the process and potentially a very helpful one.
And recognizing that this is a lot of work, public speaking as well. So I think that's part of your brain thinking, yeah, I really have to focus and be in top form here. And I'll let you in on a little secret. So I love my job and I love speaking to groups. I love it. But every time before I speak, often about an hour before, I think to myself, this is so much work. Oh, I don't know. Can I do it? And then I think, yes, you think this every time about an hour before. Then I get into the, workshop or keynote. And sometime, often around the middle of it, I'll think to myself, I love this. This is the best work ever. So even I, who truly love it, will have that feeling of hesitation of, and you work through it and think about the opportunity you have with it.
Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing that. It is such a real thing. I get that before networking events in a big way. When I sign up for something that is outside of the house and it means I have to get dressed in real clothes and put on shoes and go downtown and find someone to look after the kids, blah, blah, blah. I always have this, and I expect it now, right? It's this conversation, an internal one, and it goes back and forth. And I've come to recognize that I just need to accept that is the preamble to the thing that I know that I really want to do. Same with speaking. I feel like I have that same conversation because it is a lot of preparation and holding all of the information in your mind in lead up. It is a ton of work. And so if anybody listening has a similar conversation going on in their minds, whether it's public speaking or networking or doing that thing that deep down you want to do, but in the moment you try to talk yourself out of it, that too is normal. So thank you, Stephanie. I'm so glad you brought that up because it's so relatable. And we wouldn't want people talking themselves out of these opportunities because of that conversation. So I love, love, love that. Speaking of you getting ready for your whatever it is, a workshop, a presentation, a keynote, what do you do to get yourself in the zone?
It's so important to be very deliberate about getting myself in the zone. I say this because my brain needs a certain amount of space so that I can focus on this hard work. And I learned early on in my speaking career to carve out the time for it. I tend to have a routine before I speak. And part of that is always arriving early so that I have time to set up, which I think is a good thing for pretty much anywhere you're presenting, if you can. And then you're not stressed by not being able to find a parking spot or having the subway down for 5 minutes or whatever comes up. So having this routine, being early, but also really being intentional about what I'm thinking about and the information I'm allowing to come in to me. So for me, this means not checking my phone, my email, my messages, often within an hour or two before the presentation. And that's because I could get some message, it could be a personal message from a family member asking something unreasonable, or it could be a professional message from someone who says, so sorry, we need to change the date of your workshop. So you get that kind of message and it just goes around and around in your brain and you feel like you need to solve it, which is very normal. But you can't, because what you need to be doing is focusing on your presentation. So for me, I block a lot of that out quite intentionally thinking about what I'm going to do. So when I'm, walking over to the law firm or I'm sitting on the SkyTrain on my way, I'm thinking, okay, here's the group of lawyers I'm going to talk to. I picture them in my head. And then I think about, so what do they want to learn? What might the rest of their days be looking like? They probably have a lot of work to do right after this. I usually speak first thing in the morning when people are most awake and engaged. And then I think, what do I want to share with them? Like, what are the key messages I'm hoping they'll take away from this? So just being intentional by thinking about what I'm doing beforehand, I find really helpful. And, I'm a professional speaker, so I can do this. I can create my schedule, my calendar. I know not all lawyers can do that, and they're very busy working on different files. But even carving out 15 minutes before, 10 minutes before, you'll find it's time really well spent, because then when you are presenting, you're so much more focused. So you'll be much better at what you're doing. You'll probably also be more efficient because you'll have thought through where you want to go with it. So it'll actually save you time. So trying to focus, I find really helpful. How about you, Paula? What do you do just before you present?
Excellent. Thank you so much for asking. And before I respond to your question, I wanted to just highlight what I love about your response. First of all, the fact that you've done this repeatedly, right? We said at the beginning, one of the things that can help you overcome your fear of public speaking is just by doing it on repeat. And what I've experienced, because public speaking is not something that I feel is like a really natural thing for me. I do quite a bit of it and I enjoy it when I do it. And I also need to work at it, right? It's one of those things where I really have to discipline myself. And what I have found is that over time, it gets easier. I feel less anxious about doing it. And also I start to develop, much like you talked about, these habits and rituals and ways of approaching public speaking so that it is successful in my eyes, right? So that I set myself up for the best delivery possible. And that does involve having rituals, systems that I follow. If it's something that I do repeatedly, because you'll find there's certain things that you do that are the same. And so you can systematize. If you're a litigator going to court, chances are you've got some systems and protocols that you follow in order to get yourself in the zone and also not to miss things and be prepared. So I think all that is really helpful. I also love giving yourself that gift of time, right? And for so many of us, and for lawyers in particular, really hard to set aside that time. But when you set aside that time, you're absolutely right, Stephanie. It gives your mind that chance to come into focus, that you can really be concentrated on the thing that you're about to do, which gives you also that capacity to think about the questions that you are asking, right? What is the key message that I'm trying to deliver here? Who am I going to be connecting with? If you have a list of the attendees, looking at their profiles or reviewing the list of names just to get yourself in touch with those people before you physically enter the room, if it's an in-person or on a Zoom room. So I would say my getting in the zone process is very similar. I limit the incoming communications because I don't want that distraction that you talked about. If you get upset, it's really hard to get back on track sometimes. And do you really need to read that email at that point? Probably not. There's nothing you can do about it if you're about to step into like an hour long or whatever long presentation. So all of that. The other thing that I will typically do, especially if I'm about to do a formal presentation, is I will write out a goal for myself. I use the same format that I use for creating bigger goals, which is really to set out the specific intention of the presentation. What am I trying to achieve here? Why does it matter? What is the reason for this particular speaking engagement? And sometimes the first answer is, well, I said I would, but then why? Like, why is it important? Like, if I think about today's conversation, why are we doing this? Well, we are trying to provide a useful resource to lawyers who may have a public speaking event coming up. They might feel a bit anxious about it. They might want some tips. They might want to hear from someone like you, Stephanie, who does this professionally on a regular basis and learn something that they don't already know that they can incorporate into their own speaking, whether it's, true public speaking in that classic auditorium sense or in their interpersonal communications within a firm setting. So there's a lot of reasons for doing it. And again, when I start to think about those reasons, it shifts the focus off of me and how nervous I might be and into what the purpose is of that communication. I also ask myself what kind of energy or emotion I want to bring. Is it confidence? Is it compassion? Is it authority? Is it curiosity? And so depending on what I'm doing, I'll pick different emotions, and that helps me to channel those emotions. Then I think, okay, what steps do I need to take? What actions do I need to take? How long is this going to be? How long do I need to prepare? How long am I going to be presenting? And then I also ask myself sort of a wild card question. Is there anything else here that I need to think about? Is there anything here that could go terribly wrong that I should anticipate and deal with? And all of that follows an acronym. Great. So goal, reason, energy, actions, time. And then that sort of wild card is an exclamation point. So that's what I do. And it really helps me, especially in those moments leading up to a presentation, to focus. It helps me tune out the outside world, close down or dial down the volume on how nervous I might be if I'm nervous, and focus more on what it is I'm trying to deliver. And that time piece I also find really helpful, because if this is something that is difficult, right? If you're going to do a public speaking event and you're feeling quite anxious about it, or you're going to court and you're feeling quite anxious about it, if you can put a time frame on it, it's 5 minutes in front of a judge, or it's 30 minutes, then you've now put a cap on the amount of discomfort that you're going to experience. And so it just makes it feel less overwhelming. So that's my getting in the zone ritual, I suppose, or some of the things that I do. And I agree with you. I think having a process that you can follow really does help to land you so that you hit the ground running, that you're prepared for the speaking in whatever capacity you're speaking. My next question for you, Stephanie, is, and this is something that I think you have so much experience and value in sharing with us, which is structuring a presentation, because I think that really is the foundation of delivering an effective talk, is knowing what's going to happen. And so I'd love to hear from you how you approach that process.
Yes. Thinking about our audience and all the different talks they could be structuring. So I'm thinking about how to kind of apply this to everything, but it really is. So again, thinking about who you're talking to and what they're interested in and what they are looking for. And then thinking about, what do you have to share with them? What is most important that you get across to them, and why? Because if you can think through the why you're doing it, that also will help you be more persuasive in the beginning, especially to help bring everyone who you're talking to on board as well. And then for structure, I think people get bored with listening to one person go on and on. This is different if you're arguing your case in court, although you can use, certain elements for an argument, but especially so giving your audience a chance to reset. For me, that means making my workshops and talks fairly interactive, where I might throw a question out and have people talk about it in pairs, and then we all come back together. Or where, I might even a rhetorical question, especially if you can't actually have your audience doing something interactive. People answer a rhetorical question in their brains. They stop and do that when you throw it out there. So that's another way for people to reset. You want to be resetting probably every 5 or 10 minutes with something you're doing. And this is where, if you're using slides, can be really helpful for that too, showing maybe an unexpected slide, an interesting slide. I know for me, I use a lot of pictures on my slides. I don't have a lot of text, so that when the new slide comes up, people are like, oh, what's there? I want to look at that. I wonder how this relates. So it's, again, trying to keep resetting, getting people back in and keeping them from drifting off. And then also thinking about leaving space for questions and what can come up. And for me, it works well with what I'm doing, is I always say in the beginning, we have time for questions. If you have a related question, please feel free to ask it, but we'll still finish on time, because no one wants to ask a question and then finish late. So it's good to let them know that ahead of time. And so sometimes the people can throw out questions or share good experiences they have, and then that also acts as a reset so that people can keep listening, keep being engaged with what you're doing. Other things I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about what I want to get across for different topics, and what are exercises people can do, or ways for people to think about it in a different way that works with that specific topic. So I have a few things I like doing. I like doing quizzes. I like doing discussions in pairs. I like making a list of legalese words. That's always really fun. But I'm also often I'm really adapting to what it is I'm talking about and the different situations and whether I think people will be comfortable talking and helping them get comfortable to talk and share, because I'm always trying to make my presentations more of a conversation. And like I say, so if you're presenting your closing argument in court, it's not a conversation, clearly, but you can think about some of these elements, throwing out a rhetorical question, maybe stopping with a pause just before some really important information. So then everyone thinks, oh, what's she going to say next? And leans forward and then listens. Something about how you can apply some of what you see other great speakers do to whatever it is you're talking about in your own setting.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I love what you're talking about with this reset. And that's a pretty key word. I am going to register that because that really is what you're doing. And you're absolutely right. The wall of talk emanating from one human, it can be hard to follow. And I have found that I have a pretty high threshold for that. I feel like I will listen to a lot of talk, but I also appreciate that that is not normal.
You have a special superpower of listening.
I might. I don't know, because often it's in a podcast format, so I'm doing something else and I'm listening. So I really love the sound of someone else's voice taking me through a story. But that being said, I find I can also get really lost. And if I'm the one delivering a presentation, I need to be really mindful that others probably don't want to digest information the same way I do. So that's an area where I've really had to do some digging and figure out how to do that reset that you're talking about. And so for anyone who's thinking about how to structure a presentation, I like to break it up into chunks. I like to look at the time allotted and then start thinking about, you mentioned 5-10 minutes. Okay, we're going to spice things up with some sort of an activity or a slide or a distraction or a pause or a question, a rhetorical question. So thinking about your space, dividing it into chunks, the way that I would structure a day, I'll chunk it up. I like to think about real estate. Where's the high impact? Like, where am I going to lose people and where will I already have them, or where could I lose them? And then try to spice it in that way. And also think about what is potentially going to go wrong. So when I'm delivering, for example, a webinar and I ask a question, put it in the chat. I just assume nobody's going to put it in the chat. If they do, that's amazing. Especially with lawyers, there's different groups of people. Some people will absolutely go ahead and share and engage and participate in other groups. And I'm sure you have this online and in person, where you just don't know who you're going to get, and the tone of the room matters. And so if you can plant people inside the audience that are going to do something, I find that can be really helpful, because once an audience person sees another person speak, they might feel more comfortable doing it. Nobody wants to go first. So can you plant people? Can you ask particular questions? Sometimes I'll plant questions ahead of time. If I'm worried that I won't receive any questions, I might plant some questions and say, okay, well, here's a common question just to get things started. So to the person who's thinking about structuring, I love everything that you have shared about looking for that reset. Are you resetting often enough within the context of the discussion that people are not falling asleep, especially if it's you talking the whole time, right? You're responsible. There's that onus of figuring out how we're going to keep everybody entertained. And I feel like maybe your journalism background, you mentioned you have over 10 years of experience with, I think it was a CBC in journalism. Radio. Right. You're fighting for the attention of humans. And so how do you maintain their attention? And so these are some really great suggestions for how to do that.
May I follow up on one thing you said? I really like the way you talked about real estate and thinking about where people are paying the most attention, because it's really interesting. Research shows that whatever event we attend, we will remember the beginning and the end of it the most, not everything in the middle. So this is really important to think about when you're thinking about structuring a presentation as well. Having a really strong beginning, not just kind of waffling into it, but thinking about something interesting, a way you can catch your audience's attention and set up what you're talking about and sound confident in the beginning and also at the end, finishing with that strong. Often you're reinforcing what you've already talked about, and you're challenging is a great way to finish, depending on context as well, but challenging your audience to even think this through moving forward so they have something to leave with as well. So thank you for real estate. I love that way of thinking about it.
No, I love you highlighting the valuable real estate. That's the beginning. That's the end. I mean, time of day also matters, right?
Yes.
I think we've talked about that, about how judges will give different length sentences depending on whether you probably know this better than I do, the hearing is before or after lunch. My husband reported to me on the weekend that they have a similar study for doctors in terms of the surgery recommendations. That also changes depending on the time of day. So I don't have the citation for these studies, but just thinking about these things in advance, and so that you can come in prepared for capturing and maintaining the attention of your audience. So I love that. Thank you.
Just funny story, thinking about time of day. I know what you mean. I don't have the numbers for it either, but one of the proudest moments of my career was when I was speaking to a group of judges and I was the second speaker after lunch. So at the final day of the conference. So I think it was like 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's a dangerous time. I mean, lunch is digesting. You've kind of already had that mid-afternoon coffee. You're just really tired. You want to be done. It was a great group. And they even told me later, oh, wow, that's the hardest time to talk in. But that was really interesting. That was really good. I was like, oh, thank you. If I can do that, I can do anything. Remind myself of that.
Stephanie, you are amazing. That is basically the time that we're recording this.
That's right.
For everyone who's joined us, 3:30 your time. It's my lunchtime. So I guess we're both in our little pockets. And 3 in the afternoon for me, that's when my energy just evaporates. And so to be able to communicate in a way that engages and creates energy, that's part of your job, right? As the speaker. And so it
really takes planning. Definitely.
Yes, 100%. My next question is about building connection. And so we've talked a few times about you have an audience and you're trying to present in a way that engages them. And connection is a huge part of that. So would love to hear from you some strategies in person and online for connecting with the person that you're trying to reach.
This is it's next level for your presentation. So first, you're thinking about the people you're talking to. You're thinking about having something of substance, something of value to give them. But then you have to connect with them for them to receive it. And it's important to think about this ahead of time so that you can do it effectively. And I say that because we often just put so much work into what it is we're saying, but not how we get it across. And so I think thinking about your notes is very important here and going as old school as possible. And by that, I mean paper is your friend, as opposed to, say, reading off a screen. I know when you're especially speaking to someone virtually, it's very tempting to just have everything up on the screen. Either you have another screen next to you, you can put it there, or you can split your screen and have those questions handy. The problem with reading from a screen is that you actually do that generally. You read, as opposed to lift it off the page, glance at it, get your question, get whatever it is, or your note, and then say it to the other person. And I think the most boring thing in the world is listening to someone read to you. And even more boring in a video meeting is listening to someone read to you, unless it's an amazing story. But for a presentation, you want to be presenting it and sharing it with your audience. So being conscious of that, and in your notes, having just notes as opposed to full, perfectly formed sentences. And I know it's very tempting to have the perfectly formed sentences because then you won't have any mistakes. And that's true if you were writing. But talking to people is so much more than just writing. It's actually talking to people and connecting with them. And that's why I would recommend you just have notes, because then you can lift your eyes from the page. You won't be stuck on your page getting every perfect comment and that you've written on there. Instead, you're looking up, you're looking at the people you're talking to, and you're making eye contact with them. We all want to see each other's eyes. This has been part of the difficulty with some of virtual presentations as well. So if it's over video, make sure you're looking at the camera regularly and try to position your screen, the video box kind of right under the camera. So as you look at the people's reactions, it's right by your camera. So that's more natural. That's what I've done with you right now. I have you in a little box right under my camera because I want to see your face, right? We all want to look at each other's faces. We have to keep looking at that camera. And in person, so it's very natural to look down at your notes every so often and look up from your notes. I generally have an outline that I've created ahead of time as well. I've memorized my outline. I have not memorized my notes. I'm very familiar with them. I've practiced them, but I haven't memorized them because if I know my outline, I know where I am within my notes, but I can look at my notes when I need to, and I don't need to look at every word on my notes. They're more to reassure me, to know I have them, and it's quite natural to look down at them and then up at the people I'm talking to. Another note there, I know I've seen some people presenting, speaking to large groups from their phones. And I would say this is a really terrible idea because your phone is never big enough. Even a tablet, it's awkward the way you hold it and have to swipe it. It's much more natural to look at from a piece of paper. The paper is much bigger. And the phone is so small, we generally need to hunch over and then squint and look down at that tiny phone. And that, again, your body posture doesn't convey confidence and you don't make a connection. And people think, oh, they're just reading to me off their phone. I could have done that on my own. It's not very exciting or very dynamic. So that's really important part for connection. I would also say, don't forget to smile. This is a mistake I see so often. Smiling is just wonderful. And of course, in the appropriate context, something might be very serious, sad, then you're not smiling, of course. But often, before you start speaking, just smile at the group. Smiling is great. It'll help you feel better, but it also makes all the people you're in the room with feel better because as humans, we have this natural instinct to mirror each other. And so the other people in the room will actually probably start smiling back without even noticing that they're doing it. And then you'll feel better. So it's just this really easy thing to do. And you can even write it on your notes every so often, a little smile. And of course, you want to be genuine and authentic, but sometimes we have to, when we're nervous, we have to remind ourselves of these more normal things we do in conversation. Say if we were sitting down to lunch, of course we'd be smiling at each other as we were talking, as we, talking about something happy. And as we saw each other, because we'd be delighted to see each other. But when you're nervous and stressed, sometimes you're just focused on what you have to say without thinking about some of those more human ways of connecting with the other person.
100%. And I can see you because we're doing this interview on Zoom. And so I can see your beautiful smile. And I feel like we're able to make eye contact through Zoom. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at your face and you look like you're looking at my face. All of those things I think help with connection. And the thing that I resonated with the strongest in terms of what you've just shared, and it's super nuanced, is that idea of speaking from your notes versus speaking from another part of you. And I have a really hard time putting it into words because it's something that I notice, like right now, even I can tell, okay, I'm speaking as in a conversation. I'm not reading off my notes. I do have notes though, because I have questions and I'm looking at the questions and I'm asking you the questions. And a good example of this is in introductions. And so you and I talked before we got on this recording that the introduction, I keep it relatively brief. I'll say a few words. I try to never read an introduction when I'm introducing a person, because whenever I'm in a room and somebody is being introduced and someone's reading off a page, it's like my brain turns off. There's something human about hearing something that is already it's prepared, it's being read. I don't know what it is. I'm sure there's some science behind it. I tune out. Whereas if somebody were to say just a few words and it sounds fresh, I'm more likely to listen, even if it's a recording of something. And so I think there's a human something going on where we're registering the live communication better. We're not tuning it out. And when we're speaking too, right? If I'm focused on reading off a page, I'm not thinking about what I'm saying anymore. I'm actually thinking about reading the thing that's on the page. And so I'm less capable of engaging with my material. And this takes practice. If you think about a junior litigator, I know when I first started as a litigator, I was reading off the page because that's what I had to do, right? I had to cover all the different things. And there may be super technical parts of something that you're explaining where you need to refer to notes. But as a general rule for engagement, if you can find a way to learn the material so well that you no longer need to read it, that you've internalized it, you could explain it 5 different ways, you're going to come across so much more engaging and connected because you're connected, right? You're not disengaged reading off the page. You're actually connected with your material. So I think that's a really key point. I really hope for everyone listening that they can relate to that too, right? They can think about, oh yeah, that time I gave the presentation and I nailed it. And maybe that was part of it, right? Your familiarity, the preparation, the connection with the material, with the people. versus if it's something that maybe you weren't so familiar with, where you had to read it off your phone, you had no other choice. It's just a different vibe altogether. So I think that's really key for that connection piece. So thank you. My next question for you, Stephanie, which I am now reading off the page against my own advice. Well, maybe I'll do it just as an example, but what can you start to do if you lose people? E.g., energy in the room drops, someone yawns, people check their phone. So the question there, of course, is, and you've already talked about that reset. And so maybe we're going further into that question, but what can you do? And I've had that happen where you're on a Zoom room, for example, and everyone is off screen, so you can't see their faces, or you're in a physical room and somebody yawns and you think, oh God, what have I just done to make this person yawn? So what are your recommendations in terms of, or maybe you never lose people, in which case
this happens to everyone. Shut up.
If you figured out something even more powerful, but what do you recommend to bring people back?
Yes. So part of this is good planning, good structure. You have your resets, but it is really good to be monitoring the room all the time for what's happening. If people are looking confused, stop, maybe reinforce what you've just said, ask if there's a question or suggest your own question. One common question about this is, and then you can get into it a little bit more to show that you are listening to them. Watching the room to see what people want to say, to see what people are engaging with or maybe not engaging with. Also throwing a question out to the room. How has this worked for you? What have you learned in your practice as a way to do this that works well? Then people will answer that. That's a reset, different voice speaking. It's great to share the experience in the room. Also, all the other people think, oh, she might ask me later. I might have to answer a question. So then they kind of sit up and it helps them pay attention a little bit more too. Sometimes people just need a break. Be aware of that too, if you're having a longer talk. Yes, I think just showing that you're aware of what's happening, but not making it negative. No one likes to be called out or told they're not paying attention. Couple things too, internally as a speaker. Remember to, I've always said, assume the best. Actually, this is like a motto for my marriage with my husband, like, let's assume the best, whatever we're doing, that the other person had really good intentions. And I was just reading a great book last night called Unreasonable Hospitality. And it talks about making the charitable assumption. And this means don't read a negative assumption into the other people in the room. So maybe someone seems like they're not interested, but they just got some really bad news before they came in, or they just found out they're going to be assigned to this very busy file they'll have to get on as soon as they are done this workshop. And their mind has gone there because it's hard for it not to go there. So we don't know the background. So it's just good to be gracious and assume the best of the people in the room. And also know, while you're monitoring, you're responding to the feedback the room is giving you, you also can't know everything in it. I can't tell you how many times over the course of my speaking career, I've had people talk to me and they say, 3 years ago, I saw you do this workshop, and now that's like a Zoom workshop. So I maybe didn't even see them. And it changed how I do this. And I've always been doing this ever since. And thank you. And I'll think, wow, if it was in person, I don't think I even met you at the workshop or particularly noticed you, or I didn't talk to you because it's a video workshop, but I have actually affected them in a really good way. I did have valuable information to share. So remember that you don't always know, people don't always share in that really obvious way that they're actually taking in and really appreciating your information. And I think this happens often. And it's something I remind myself too, so that I don't get too affected by, sometimes there's one or two people in the room who are not as focused, not as good at paying attention as you wish they would be. And so as a speaker, it can be easy to focus on them and think, oh no, they're not paying attention. The whole room must be bored. That's probably not true at all, and we have a tendency as humans to focus on the negative much more than the positive. So remember, try not to let that one person affect your whole sense of how something is going. So, be aware, but have grace for the room and think about the larger context and trust yourself too.
Beautiful. These are really helpful suggestions. One of the things that you touched on, if you ask a question of the group and people think, oh, I might be called on, I better pay attention. In the right setting, I will sometimes ask everybody to share a takeaway at the end of a presentation. It actually helps with that real estate thing, making the end impactful. It's not coming from me necessarily, but what I love about takeaways is that then everybody hears from each other and you learn as a speaker what people actually connected with, what mattered to them. They get a recap of much of what you've talked about, and they get to see what each other has identified as important. And it also serves that purpose of people are now engaged, because as they're listening to you speak, they're mentally filtering through the information and thinking, well, what is my takeaway here? And if you lay that groundwork ahead of time, right? I think sometimes people just need that structure. I clearly am a structure person. I like knowing the roadmap ahead of time. If, we're partway through a presentation, and actually, I was just going to say, we're kind of getting close to time. And so I think I have one or two more questions depending. And so, yeah, please.
So may I say, just talking about structure, and I think the structure is essential to having a good presentation. But then it's moving to that next step beyond structure where ideally, and we don't all live in an ideal world, but ideally, you know your structure well enough so that you are free within it. If there are certain questions or it moves in a different way with your audience, you are free to do that because you have a sense of where you had wanted to go, what's important here, what you can drop out as well.
100%. And if you're able to mentally move the blocks around in your mind, right? You'll see that in court where the judge might skip ahead and ask you a question. And so if you're able to mentally move that part of your argument up in time and address it, and then you can go back to the flow of your argument, again, it comes back to preparation. And there's another parallel here, which is if you think of a calendar, right? I'll often do this with a calendar, or people will say, well, I don't want to plan my week because I know I'll get interrupted. But if you schedule out a week and then you know that you have to move something because something new comes in, you're going to put it somewhere else. You're going to take that block and you're going to move it kind of like a Tetris game. So if you can do that mentally with a presentation you're delivering, maybe you can sense that people want to talk about topic B and you are going to talk about that later, but you bring it up to a different spot in the discussion. That allows you to be more agile. You can respond to the thread of interest within the group. And so it makes for a more dynamic presentation. I guess going back to that point about if everything is scripted and you're reading off the page, there's a different energy to it relative to that free flowing conversation. And I think finding a balance, right, between that structure and the flexibility so that people know where they're going. There's a timeline. Nobody wants to sit there an extra 20 minutes because the speaker didn't finish on time, which has never happened to me ever. So I think, Stephanie, speaking of structure and time, we've got time. I'm going to ask you one last question, which is what we alluded to. And you've covered basically all of the questions that I had. We've talked about so much already, what public speaking is all about, and in many different shapes. We've talked about how to address anxiety over speaking, how to get in the zone, how to structure a presentation, how to build connection. And one of the things we talked about at the very beginning is that idea of reflecting on what has just happened, how you might feel after a presentation. I'd love for you to share maybe just a few suggestions for what you might do after a presentation to reflect and with a view to improving, right? We all do that, or I wish we all did that. I wish I did that. And then how can you expect to feel, right, after delivering a presentation?
Yes. Great question. And I love that we're talking about this because I really believe the presentation doesn't finish with your last word in the room. It finishes when you have this reflection piece. And it's so important to know you will feel, at first, you'll probably feel relieved it's done or elated it went so well. And then shortly after, you'll feel really tired because as we discussed, this is a lot of work. So if you can, try not to schedule anything too taxing in the next couple hours after. It's not always possible, but sometimes you can do that. But especially in the few minutes after the presentation, if you can set aside some time, I always do this. So if you ever have me come speak, try taking the elevator down to the lobby of your building after, and you'll find me sitting there with my notebook, which right now happens to be a nice lavender color. I'm holding it up for you here. And I take a few minutes and I write in here, or I bring a piece of paper that I can put in here, and I write notes about how it went. So what went well, if there were any technical issues, so I know that if I'm going back, and what I want to work on for the future. And I find taking that time, and it might take 5-10 minutes to go through, write that down, that allows me to finish, to wrap it up, to tie it up with a bow. And then it doesn't need to keep going around and around in my brain. thinking, I should have done that differently. I got to remember that. I got to think of this different thing. Or, oh, yeah, that thing actually worked really well. Okay, now I know it's on paper, it's there. I can review it again, and it is finished. And I find that really helpful. And it really, I think, helps me improve as well. The other thing I would highly recommend is after that, if you can, try to go outside, even just for a few minutes. So maybe you're just walking on the block to get a coffee and it's downtown, whatever. Maybe you're at home, you go outside, you walk around the block. And I say this because, as I say, your brain will be tired from focusing so much. If you can go outside without your phone, without listening to anything, but just walk, let your thoughts wander, observe what's around you, that allows you to just let your attention kind of rest because you're just sort of noticing. You're not focusing it with so much effort. And that allows your brain to regain some of its strength to get ready for the next thing you want to do. So that's really helpful to take that little break if you can. If you can take a bit of a longer break, that is great too. But I know people can have very busy days. And going outside was really helpful because you get a much bigger perspective than if you're inside in your little office or your little room.
Amazing. Thank you. You're bringing back memories of when I used to litigate, and the walk to the office from the courthouse to the office was part of the transition of getting back into the swing of things. Stephanie, thank you so much. I feel like we could talk for hours, and unfortunately, we will not be able to do that today, but future conversations would be amazing. For anybody who is interested in working with you, whether as a coach or having you come to their firm or organization and speak, where can we find you? Where can we learn more about you?
Sure. My website is stephaniecmitchell.com. So you can find me there. I have a newsletter too that I send out every few months with lots of practical advice, but it's also pretty fun. I like to think I try to make it really interesting when it arrives in your inbox. If you want to sign up for my email newsletter, you can do that there too. So stephaniecmitchell.com. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. I'd be really happy to be in touch with any of your listeners.
Amazing. And now I'm super conscious of the fact that this is high value real estate.
Oh, yeah.
We need to say something really important. So for everyone who has joined us, thank you. First of all, it's been so great having you here. Stephanie, thank you for joining. It's been amazing. I've really loved our conversation. And maybe the high impact statement, although I'd love to hear if you have something to add here, is to think about what we talked about today and what takeaways you may have as a listener in terms of what you could apply the next time you have a speaking event, whether it's public speaking in an auditorium or the conversation you're about to have with somebody next door. So thank you again for joining. Stephanie, is there anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I guess I would also just say everyone who's listening, the fact that you're listening, you're on the right track. Trust yourself. You will do a great job. And I would love to come hear you speak one day.
100%. And you made it to the end, the listener who's still here. So you've absorbed everything that we've had to share with you today. And that's great. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Stephanie. And I look forward to seeing everyone again next week. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.